Hey, what's going on, guys? Today is an exciting day. Today, we've got John from Trinnov, as well as a friend of mine, Joe Walter from Wisdom Audio. Guys, how y'all doing? Exciting day today. We've got John from Trinnov,
Oh,
as well as a friend of
there's a
mine.
delay here. I may have to do something about that.
Uh-oh. So, Joe, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Okay,
I
so
can hear you, but I also hear you after a few seconds. The internet is
interesting.
bouncing back and forth.
I got you.
I had to mute the live stream, John. That's what it did for me.
Yes, if you have another tab open with the video playing in the background, then that would cause kind of a
I don't, but
so I mute
I
the
can try to
volume on
close
that
a
one.
few just in case.
Well, good
Echo,
deal,
echo,
man.
niner, niner.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me say hi to some folks that are in the chat. We've got Bader's here. Looks like we've got Sanja. Thanks for being here. Salk is in the house. Tristan, we're keeping up with the Joneses. Mel. Who else we got over here? Jessen, glad to have you. And we're going to have a good time. This past weekend, I had the incredible opportunity to fly up to Georgia to check out in kind of a ridiculous but absolutely phenomenal Wisdom Audio and Trinnov home theater. Met a new friend, Alex. He just got a beautiful home, and we just had a great time just kind of getting to know his system. And so I wanted to invite these two gentlemen, Joe and John, onto the channel to kind of just really pick their brain and give you over in the chat an opportunity to ask questions, and just give you an opportunity just one-on-one to hang out with these guys. But kind of before we get into the questions, John and Joe, thanks so much again for being here. Maybe just kind of tell our audience who you are and your role, and then maybe even just kind of how you got in the audio hobby. So whoever wants to go first.
Joe, why don't you head up?
Sounds good. Well, my audio life started very young. I was about 5 years old, taking my dad's stereophonic, his little console stereo part in the basement and taking the speakers out of it and trying to put them on a little portable cassette player that I had to have it play bigger. And then when I was 14, I started tinkering with car audio in my parents' car. This was back in the 70s because I'm kind of old. But it was before car audio was really a thing. And so, you had to kind of make do with what you could find and what you could build, which led me into a career in retail and audio in the early 80s, which landed me at Harman, which is JBL, Infinity, Harman Kardon. I was there for 28 years before I came over to Wisdom Audio in 2018. And I did a lot of stuff from car audio, home audio, theaters, calibrations, training, pretty much everything. And of course at Wisdom, it's really focused on the high-end audio, theaters, calibrations, all that kind of fun stuff. So it's been a great career. I love the audio stuff, and I just can really never get enough of it. And theaters like Alex's, the guys at Atlanta Home Theater, they just knock it out of the park every single time. So
yeah, for sure. Very cool.
Well,
John, how about you?
I didn't realize that Joe and I had such a similar background. We haven't worked for the same company, until I left Wisdom and he joined Wisdom, so that we worked for Wisdom, although not together.
Gotcha.
But I also started, there's a picture of me somewhere when I was, I don't know, like 2 years old, climbing up on a chair so I could put my Chipmunks records on the Magnavox machine, and I had to reach down in for the turntable. But I sort of got started in the business when I was 13, and I've been in it ever since.
Wow.
And retail, manufacturing. I was a brief stint as a manufacturer's rep, mostly on the manufacturing side. Some of the companies were Mark Levinson and Proceed and Snell Acoustics, Wisdom Audio, and of course now I'm with Trinnov.
Nice. Super cool. So the cool thing about that is kind of all three of us, we started kind of at a young age. I remember Dolby Pro Logic was my first Pioneer receiver, and I've always been passionate about audio and especially home theater. But just to see, especially when we were at Alex's house, we had over a century of expertise as well as just experience in audio. So honestly,
that's
that was
what you're saying. You had a bunch of old guys,
basically, but we just had a blast, man. So, but again, just thanks so much for being on here. And so honestly, let's just go and jump into it. I even saw some questions early on. So here we go. So here's one from Mel. So one question for John: does the Altitude 16 have the speaker audio visualizer like the 32 does? Please tell me it does.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the Dolby Atmos object viewer. And yeah, the two machines run the same software. There are a couple of really minor differences having to do with the fact that we have more flexible triggers on the Altitude 16 because it was designed after the 32 and we learned a few things. But apart from that, it's the same software. So yeah.
Very cool. So and one's a 16 channel. And so for those that aren't familiar, the Altitude is a processor. So there's no internal amplifier. And it'll process, one of them does 16 channels and one of them does 32 channels, correct?
Well, one does 16 and one does as many as 32. Okay. You can buy it with either, with 8, 16, 24, or 32 channels, depending on, what you need. You don't have to buy more than you need.
Right. And I think I even saw on your website that you have expandability even further than that with another device. Is that correct?
Yeah. If you need to go beyond 32, back in 2017, maybe 2018, we introduced the Altitude 48 extension, which along with some additional software allows you to render and decode up to 48 unique channels, which presumably would be some combination of Atmos and DTS:X Pro and Auro 3D if you wanted to go that deep, and up to 64 processed channels for things like active crossovers on the Wisdom speakers or really sophisticated bass management, stuff like that.
Gotcha.
And so we don't sell a lot of those, but they're we've got maybe half a dozen so far here in the US and a fair number of them in the Far East.
Yeah. So Trinnov kind of opens up kind of the world of possibilities, probably from somebody like myself that just has, for a long time, I just had an AVR.
Right.
So it's kind of like an all-in-one box. You've got the processing, you've got the decoding, and you've got the video switching and amplification. And it really wasn't until maybe a year or two ago that I migrated over to separates and had my first processor, which is a Marantz. So that's still kind of just very common. But some of the technology and the tools, and especially you were able to share during that video, the things that the Trinnov is capable of doing sounds pretty exciting.
Well, we're very fortunate in that the folks who founded the company developed this really powerful platform initially for their own research, and then it sort of evolved into the same basic research platform became a real product.
Yeah.
So it can do a lot of stuff and it's quite flexible.
Very cool. I saw another question over here. I'm trying to find it. And feel free, as we're going through this and we're having a conversation, if you see something in the chat. I've got the other question right here. It's from Steve. He says, with so many multiple tweeters, so this is talking about Wisdom, your speakers look a lot different than your traditional speaker. So we've got lots of speakers, lots of mid-range drivers, kind of a long tweeter section. So what happens if one of those dies, and how do you really know if you've blown a tweeter, if you've got that many, drivers in that? So maybe kind of share with us on that.
Oh, you're muted.
We lost your audio.
How about that?
There you go.
Sorry, I was muted during my quiet time there. So it's interesting that you bring up our tweeters. So I happen to have a couple of our tweeters here. Nice. So this is actually a tweeter from our Sage series. This is a planar magnetic film. I don't know if everybody can kind of see that on the camera right there, but all these little squiggly lines that go back and forth, that's basically your voice coil. And so there's magnets on the front and then there's magnets on the back. You can just increase the efficiency by adding additional magnets across the front and the back. That's what makes it play louder. We have these are actually printed down in Southern California for us and then laser etched in on the actual film. The film is lighter. It's actually lighter than the air. You can see it's how thin it is. It's lighter than the air that it has to move. So it's super efficient, dissipates heat. It's like a piece of aluminum foil. Like if you get aluminum foil hot and then you put your hand on it immediately from taking it away from the flame, it's not hot anymore. Our films work exactly the same way. So they dissipate heat almost as fast as the heat is generated. So they handle a lot of power, a lot of abuse. So failures, while they do happen, they're very, very rare. And while it looks like there's a lot of tweeters on our speakers, it's really just one film. So if something stops working, we would know. And I just want to show you one other one here. This is exciting. This is actually the film from a line source. So it's half of a line source. A line source has 2 of these, and that's what makes the sound that comes off. It comes straight off of this thing right here. So again, you have a huge amount of area to dissipate heat, make the sound. As far as the woofers go, they're wired either series parallel together. If one fails, you would know right away. And we just replace the whole thing. We have a 10-year warranty on our loudspeakers. So if something happens, we keep excellent records. I mean, I've had dealers that have called me after having a speaker in the field for 8-9 years, and something happened. We can pull the serial number up and see exactly when it was built, how it was spec'd, and so we have very, very good record keeping and great warranties on our product.
Man,
and even who built it, as I recall.
Even what?
Even who built it.
So, yes, even who built it.
Yeah, that's you can trace it back and say, yeah, don't do that anymore.
Yeah,
exactly. That's quite different than your traditional soft dome tweeter or even beryllium tweeter. So
yeah,
definitely a different design philosophy. But this was my first experience hearing Wisdom and first time hearing Trinnov, and phenomenal. I mean, literally, the amount. I told Alex, I said I'm actually quite jealous of the amount of immersiveness that he has in his room. Part of it, he's got a bigger room. He's got more separation than I do with his Atmos speakers up high, and then the line source a lot, lower. But my goodness, man. And talking about giving some abuse, we cranked it many times during that demo. And at no point, did any of it even have a hint of distortion. Crystal clear. And one thing that was interesting that you mentioned during the video is with the line source. That's kind of different than a point source speaker.
Yes.
The line source, you had mentioned, if you get close, pretty much everywhere in the room, you're going to be, I think you said, about 2 dB difference. So if you're sitting in the middle and you get closer to the speaker, there's probably going to be about 2 dB difference in volume. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on how far away you are. It's really the way that the sound goes. You lose half of your output over every doubling of distance. So it's 3 dB, a 3 dB drop in output for every doubling of distance that you have with a line source speaker. With a point source speaker, it's double that. It's actually 6 dB loss for every doubling of distance. Gotcha. So the benefit is when you're in a theater environment, if you are close to the speaker, your ear is close by, and with a line source speaker, if this thing was here, right, you're really only going to hear that little tiny piece. And as you get further away, you hear more of it. That's why the sound doesn't seem to get louder or quieter when you move closer or further away. So it really helps to keep you immersed in the moment of the movie rather than being distracted by a speaker that might be pulling you to the left or to the right or to your overhead, depending on where sound is coming from.
And I actually experienced that firsthand, and I didn't realize it at first. So we were in the middle of a demo, and I'm like, oh, this will be cool to get some B-roll footage of just the picture, the image quality. So I grabbed my camera, I moved off to the side, and as I'm filming, I look over, and this huge speaker is probably less than a foot from me. And granted, guys, we're cranking this thing. It's a loud demo.
Right.
And I thought back to what you had said earlier in the video, and I'm like, this is exactly what he was talking about. If I were next to, my JTR speakers a foot from it at that volume, it would have been quite not devastating, but it would not have been a pleasant experience.
Right.
And it was interesting that I could be that close and it was that loud in the overall room, but yet it wasn't real loud right next to the speaker. So I definitely experienced that firsthand. So that was pretty interesting there.
Yeah, and obviously I can back you up there because I worked at Wisdom for about 9 years. And we used to do training where we'd put on a piece of music and have people at the back of the room. And we turned up to the point where it's pretty darn loud. Yeah. And then we'd ask them to slowly walk to the front of the room until their ears were this far away from the speaker. And it hardly got louder. And experienced people in this business would look at you like, How is that happening?
Right.
But Joe's exactly right. I mean,
It makes sense.
effectively, you hear a smaller and smaller piece of the speaker as you get
Right.
closer until
Yeah.
it's only that little bit in front of your ear.
Sure. So Rocksteady's got a great question, and so maybe we can even talk about kind of the difference between a line array and a line source.
Well, I was just
But
responding back.
oh, perfect. And like I said, feel free. I mean, like this, I want it to be as interactive as possible. Feel free to
Yeah.
just talk live. Say, hey, I see Rock's got a great question. But would line array speakers work well for Atmos use?
So, first of all, there's a difference between line array and line source, and people tend to get those confused because they both have line in their name. A line array is really a combination of a bunch of point source speakers combined together with some DSP delays and some other magic tricks that they do to give you consistent sound power from the front of the room to the back of the room. So when you're at a concert and you see that big curved speaker array hanging from the ceiling, that's a line array. And so the difference is that because it's a bunch of point source speakers, it still reflects off the roof, the floor, and around the room. So you still get more reflective energy from a line array than you do from a line source. A line source is different because what it does is it takes that sound and it comes off like a cylinder off the speaker. So the sound doesn't really radiate above that line and it doesn't radiate below that line. So it doesn't interact with the floor and the ceiling. The disadvantage with that, if you're trying to do a line source overhead for Atmos, is it doesn't work the same. First of all, you have to have 48 inches of a line source to make it a line source speaker. Okay. So it would have to be a 48-inch long speaker to begin with, which is
That's
huge.
A big Atmos speaker.
That's a big Atmos speaker, right? Plus, a line source speaker also doesn't work horizontally, although we have a new horizontal line source that we're just starting to ship, and I'll talk about that later. But a line source for, like, say, a center channel, if you lay it on its side and you slide back and forth left to right, the image is going to move. It's going to move with you as you move back and forth. It doesn't stay fixed in the center like it would with a point source speaker. So using it for an overhead does not work very well or at all. However, that being said, we have done them in conference rooms where you literally put some L8 eyes in the ceiling to run the length of the conference table. So when you get to the end of the conference table, the sound stops. It's really quite remarkable. And then everybody that's at the table gets the same exact sound without having to blast somebody on one side of the room or the other. So there are applications for in-ceiling line sources, just not for a theater.
And with Alex's system, we had kind of a mixture of both. We had line source around the bed layer, and then up in the ceiling, we had point source. And so those were more directional and kind of...
Yes, much more directional. For that application, the point source is ideal. The speaker that he had was called our 0.2 V2. And basically, we have an in-ceiling version of that, which... More show and tell. I love show and tell.
All kinds of stuff, man. I love this.
All kinds of goodies there.
I know, right? This is our InCeiling ICX7A, and you can see this has it's got an angled planar driver on it. That funky little thing up on the top there, that's actually a laser, right? So I can put this in the ceiling, I can rotate it so that laser is on the same angle as the planar. So when it hits your ears, that's where you want to rotate it to. And then it's magnetic, so you just pop it right off when you're all done. So we do these a lot for Atmos channels. We also do these for 2-channel stereo because they're such high-performance loudspeakers. But Alex basically had a boxed version of this same exact speaker. Same woofer, same planar, just in a bigger box that he could hang up there, which was better for his situation.
Man, you got me drooling now. You got a laser up there. What the heck? You guys think of it? That's pretty cool, though. That's definitely, but that's a practical way, because even in my ceiling, I angled them, but I never even thought to get up there with a laser and go, okay, let me get this thing fine-tuned to where it's hitting right where my primary listening position is. That's pretty creative.
Yeah, when my boss came over from Harman, so he and I worked together for 20 years there before he went to Wisdom, and then kind of recruited me over. We had speakers with Harman that had angled tweeters, but you're trying to line them up and you're kind of eyeballing it when you're up in the ceiling, and then you sit down, you look up and you go, this is way off. So what his first thing was on these new InCeilings, he said, we need to figure out a way to have a laser attached to it, so we can do that. And so that was one of his ideas that he came up with that we implemented on the speakers.
Super cool. So it looks like we got a question here for John. Does Trinnov, well, I guess for both of you, do y'all have like a financing program? Because I mean, let's face it, your products aren't the least expensive on the market.
No,
that is for sure.
Yeah.
You know, when you're talking about an Altitude 16 processor, that is it around 18,000 now?
18,000.
Yes, I mean it's definitely not inexpensive. So any financing available for these guys?
You'd have to talk to your friendly local dealer for the financing.
Okay. So it depends on if they have that available.
Or your mortgage company, one of the two.
Well, yeah. Depending on how many years you want to finance it. Yeah.
That's right. Just put it in your loan.
Yeah.
That's funny. Oh, see, they're already putting bets out here, bets on, when I'm going to be upgraded, man. I tell you, these guys are something else. Oh, wow. Yeah. Check this one out. All Trinnov processors come with a divorce settlement.
I've been married 37 years. It hasn't been a problem for me.
That's awesome. Cool. You even got some fans here. John says he's a proud Altitude 16 owner for 4 months now. All I can say is, wow, been into this hobby since 1990. This is the best product that I've owned, man. Super cool, John.
Well, thank you very much, John. We get a lot of comments along those lines on like AVS Forum and AV Forum, which is sort of the same thing over in the UK, and places like that. A lot of folks are like, this is my 5th, 6th, 7th surround processor, and gosh, I could have saved a lot of money if I just done this at the beginning. And people are often surprised that, another common reaction is, wow, I didn't realize there was that much room for improvement that was left. But until you hear it, it's hard to appreciate just how much room there is.
Yeah. Another good question.
And the same is true for really good speakers. It's not just, what we do. And for that matter, one of the reasons why Alex's system sounded so good was that he had also done fairly extensive passive acoustic room treatment.
Correct. Yeah.
Because what we do and that stuff complement each other really well.
And I think that was great in the video, how Chuck did a great job talking about that. It's like, okay, let's do the best that we can with the room itself. And then let's add some incredible equipment and incredible speakers, incredible amplifiers. And now we've got a killer system, because we all know that you can have the best equipment in the world and you put it in a crappy room and it's going to sound like garbage.
We all know that, but there are a lot of folks out there who never stop to think about it.
Yeah. I did it for many years. That was the last thing that I did in my theater. I buy all this equipment, and one day somebody said, just clap one time real loud and listen, see what happens. Yeah. And so I walk in my theater room, I clap real loud one time, and I just hear this boing, yoing, yoing, yoing. And I went, that's probably not good. And I was like, man, so I started doing some research, and I'm like, yikes, so definitely I think it's one of those things it's an afterthought. I even thought it was snake oil for a long time. Like, this stuff.
Well, there are some snake oil products out there, but the room treatment isn't in that category.
Yeah.
No, I did a webinar a few months ago now. The main purpose of which was just to talk about, how do you get really good sound in general, whether it's stereo, multi-channel, whatever. And, our contention is that the big three are, number one, passive room acoustics. Make your room suck less, basically.
Yeah.
and not everybody can, have a full-on Keith Yates kind of design, but you do what you can. And then the second thing is to have really good speakers, because we cannot make bad speakers into good speakers. That's just not realistic. Sure. And then the third thing is the kind of stuff that we do to, the, if you will, active acoustics as opposed to passive. But if you can do those three things, pretty much everything else falls into place. Those are the biggies.
Yeah. You've got a great combination for an incredible home theater.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another good question here. Rock says, I may have put it down. What's the best speakers for Atmos? InCeiling, coaxial speakers, angled box horn loaded. And I know that's always subjective as far as what is a best. But what do you recommend in that for Atmos?
Well, a couple things to consider. Number one, the room design is going to dictate sometimes, most times, it's going to dictate what type of speaker you can or can't use. The dispersion pattern of the speaker is also going to determine, how it's used, where it's placed. With Dolby and Atmos, there's very specific angles they want you to follow to make sure that, information is moving around in the sound space the way that the engineers intended it to. As far as a horn-loaded angled box or a in-ceiling coaxial, again, that's really going to be application-based. I recommend that you try to match timbre-wise your main speakers with your surround speakers. So if you're using, a bunch of clip speakers, then you should probably have some clip speakers up top, because acoustically it's going to be better, when things are moving around the room, to keep the sonic signature similar in all of your speakers. So
Sure.
it's really going to be application driven more so than, the type of speaker driven.
Right. Gotcha.
The one difference being what Joe said earlier, that you definitely want point sources up there.
Point source in the
flavor
ceiling.
they are. Yeah.
Sure. Definitely. So BL, this is one thing that I love about doing things like this, is that we all learn. And I know, I'm 45 years old, but I daily learn something new. At least I hope I'm learning something new, and I don't want to stop learning. And so I don't want to get to the point in this hobby that I feel like I've got it all figured out, because I don't think I'll ever get there. But even just
I've
the
been
fact
doing
that,
it 50 years. I'm still learning stuff.
yeah.
So.
And so I think this is great when you guys share, like, look, this is something brand new to me. And it was definitely brand new to me too. I'd never heard of a line source and a point source. So,
well, it's funny that you say that, because I came from Harman. So, JBL professional, obviously huge into concerts, theaters, that kind of stuff. And until I started at Wisdom, I mean, I've been in the speaker business my whole life, and I had never heard of a line source or a traditional speaker being called a point source until I went to Wisdom. And so it was a technology that I had to really learn and understand. And it was one of those, the first time you hear it or experience it, it's so different from a point source speaker. And it makes so much sense in the way that it works. It's really quite remarkable.
I saw something there for a moment.
Oh yeah, I just popped it up. Sometimes I'll just throw them up there. Some comments. They said that they're enjoying the content. So these last couple of videos, people, it's kind of definitely been resonating with people. But you guys are the big boys, is what they're saying. So definitely fun.
I see
Shane,
Invisible 5 or Invisibles. It's very small print.
Yeah, it's like Invisibles, I think.
Said he asked us about dealers in Canada a couple of months ago and didn't get an answer. I apologize for that. It's usually either Chuck or me that respond. But if I was traveling at the time, which I've only recently started doing again, I may have missed it. But yes, we do have a handful of dealers in Eastern Canada, Toronto, Montreal, mostly. I think we just recently picked up somebody in Quebec City.
Cool. Super cool.
So contact me. It's john.heron@trinnov.com. So Jon, like in the little on my name, and Heron is like the bird, but with 2 R's.
Sweet, man. Definitely reach out to John. He's a great dude. He'll hook you up. So Laptop Doc says, do line source speakers need special servicing or regular maintenance compared to point source?
Not at all. And here's a kind of a funny story that goes along with that. I was out on Nantucket Island in April doing a calibration for a dealer. And another dealer that was out there wanted me to stop by this theater that they had built years ago. It had been featured in magazines, and beautiful, beautiful theater. And I sat down and listened to the first track that they played for me, and I was cringing a little. And they got done doing the demos, and they said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I think we can make some improvements. So I went back the next day after I was done with my other calibration, and I got into it was a datasat processor. And on the datasat, you have to load all of our PEQs in manually. A PEQ is like a pre-equalization curve that you put into the box electronically. It's like what they would do in a passive crossover. We just do it electronically. And we have one PEQ in the speakers that were in there, which were L75s for the LCRs. and it has an 11 dB boost at 20,000 hertz. So all the way up at the top, there's an 11 dB boost, and it's a pretty wide Q, so it boosts a lot of frequencies to make it flat in the room. Well, when I went into the data set to see what was going on, they had left off one of the zeros. So instead of having an 11 dB boost at 20,000 hertz, they had an 11 dB boost at 2,000 hertz that basically went from 1,000 up to like 10,000 hertz. It was boosted 11 dB. And it was in that room for 5 years that way. 5 years they'd been listening to it like that. Which just, that's a little testament to, and each one of those planar drivers had 500 watts a piece on them.
Right.
So they'd been playing with an 11 dB boost across most of the most sensitive area for 5 years, and it never had a problem. They never failed. They never shut off. I can't imagine how the hearing was, but we got her dialed in pretty good. So to answer the question, there's not any maintenance beyond any normal things you would do with anything else. Just give it a wipe down if you see them every now and then, wipe the dust off the cabinets. But if they're behind the screen or grills, there's really no maintenance to do at all.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah.
So Mel says he's saving up his pennies for a Altitude 16. So definitely very cool stuff. So the rest is child's play. The reality is, I mean, a lot of times it literally comes down to budget. What budget do you have available to you? And I've always tried to tell people, work with what you have. The cool thing is, you may be watching this going, man, this is cool, but I could never afford a $16,000 processor or a $10,000 speaker. But the truth is you may not be able to now, but who's to say in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you just may be starting out as a young guy, 18, 22. I mean, the demographic on my channel really is all across the spectrum, from teenagers all the way up to older adults. And so, you never know. Definitely above Youth Man's budget, though. I can tell you that it's not spare change.
A little bit. That's all.
Exactly. I need a whole lot more patrons to be able to afford that. So, I haven't even read this question, so I don't. Oh wait, I just lost it. That's one thing about StreamYard is like you'll start scrolling and then it'll jump all the way down. So I'm trying to keep it so I'm going in order because I'll end up missing.
Anton has a good question.
Yeah, go ahead and answer.
So he was asking if an Atmos mix is static, like the new Indiana Jones Atmos mix, will my wide speakers stay silent? All the objects are placed at 7.1 positions and never move. So yeah, we cannot fix a soundtrack that was built in a way that doesn't take advantage of the system. Another famous example of one is the original Wonder Woman movie. It was like a 7.1 mix, and then they just planted 4 objects up on the ceiling and never moved them at all. And then it was as though they were mixing to a 7.1.4 channel-based system instead of using the object-oriented capabilities. And it can still sound great, but we can only render what is actually in the soundtrack. So there are going to be some movies that don't take full advantage of everything that you have. Now, there is a cheat around that. If you put your Blu-ray player or wherever it's coming from in a 7.1 mode rather than sending the Atmos bit stream, you could then use one of the up mixers that we include, and that'll take advantage of all the speakers. But it won't be, it'll sound great. It'll just sound a little bit different.
Yeah.
But what we've seen, especially now that we have the object visualizer, there's still a handful of movies that are coming out, mostly from studios where I get the impression the engineers are under a lot of time pressure to just crank these things out really fast. And there are some of those that, are not as creative as we'd like. Sure. But that seems to be becoming less and less common. I think Dolby is being very successful in twisting people's arms because, they are the 800-pound gorilla. And if Dolby says you got to do something the right way,
that's right.
Sooner or later, the studios are going to pay attention.
Yeah, that's always been the frustration, is that not every Dolby Atmos disc is created equal.
Right.
It really depends on the engineers that are mixing that. There have been times where I'm watching a movie and I'm like, dude, that would have been the perfect place to have some effects that would align with what I'm seeing on the screen. There was just nothing. And like, wow, what a missed opportunity. Jessen, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things, this is audio nerd to its highest level right here, but we sit in our factory. We have a reference theater in our factory out in Carson City, and we will sit in there, and we have heights, wides, we have all the channels, and we will turn off all the mains and the main levels and listen for Atmos and other content in these different movies. And you would be amazed at how few movies take advantage of all the channels that they could take advantage of. There's not a lot of content that really utilizes all the channels like you would think they would.
Yeah. I actually did a video on that. So I actually played some content from a movie, and I turned off just my lower bed amplifier. Yep. So all we had was Atmos. So it was kind of cool. So, but it definitely
on the altitude. Sorry.
No,
on the altitude,
sometimes
there's
it's not there.
A processor page where you can either solo or mute various speakers. So it's really easy to check without having to turn amps on and off or rewire anything. You just push a button, and you can very easily, for example, just listen to what's coming out of the upper channels.
Yeah, one thing that you had showed during that demo, and when we were kind of listening to Alex's setup, and Alex is here in the chat, so glad you could join us.
Hey, Alex, Evans. How you doing?
Hey, Alex.
So in Alex's setup, you had the laptop, you had Trinnov software, and you actually showed me. I don't know if that is the optimizer that they were referring to, where you saw the dots and kind of
the yellow balls flying around. No, that's the Atmos object visualizer. Yeah,
the visualizer. So that was pretty cool. So you can visually see kind of which channels are active as you're watching a movie. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, if you're interested, if you don't know what we're talking about, just go over after the live stream, head over to YouTube and do a search for Trinnov, and you will see at least one or two examples of the object viewer doing its thing.
Yeah, super cool. Jessen got a question here, and I'm going to let you ask him. So John, touch a little bit on the Trinnov Amplitude amplifier as well. Heard dampening factor of 6,000.
I haven't memorized that part of the spec sheet, so I really can't speak to that. I know it's a great sounding amplifier. It's big traditional linear power supplies with Hypex N-core modules for the amplification stages. They're great amps. The one thing about them that is objective as opposed to subjective reactions to this, that, or the other thing. Because we come out of the pro world, everything that we build is built to pro standards, and the output capability of a pro preamplifier like an Altitude is higher than most consumer gear. So we can put out more voltage, which means you don't need as much voltage gain in the power amp to get to full power. And so we do, with our amplifiers, the gain structure is adjusted so that both the preamp and the power amp kind of run out of gas at the same time. And that's important, because if you imagine that the preamp could have gone up to here, but the power amp is already clipping, then all of the space between here and there is signal in the preamp that you just can't take advantage of. So for every dB of mismatch, you lose a dB of signal to noise ratio in the system. And so just on that basis, and leaving aside questions of, is this amplifier as good as that amplifier, but just based on the gain structure, we typically have about a 7 to a 12 dB advantage in signal to noise ratio when you use our amps with our gear. But I mean, there are a lot of good amplifiers out there. There's nothing proprietary about the interface that makes us incompatible with anything. There's just that last little bit of optimization that you can get by making sure that everything is designed to work with each other.
Sure. So Steven's got a question. He says, John, love your loudspeaker position guide and the approach to serve a listening area larger than a single seat. Joe, can you speak to the off-axis performance of line source speakers, especially the L8i?
Sure can. While they are limited on the top and the bottom to the output, they have a full 180 degrees of dispersion. So one of the demos we do in Carson City, we do with the L75 in walls. We literally have them playing with no subwoofer, no anything else. And we have people stand in the middle of the room and walk up to the wall until their nose is literally on the wall that the speakers are mounted in, and they still have a soundstage, like a 3D soundstage, even though they're standing at a wall. That's how good the off-axis performance is with our speakers, line source especially.
It's like the world's biggest headphone.
Yeah, except way better.
Yeah, and like I said, I can definitely attest to that. It was pretty incredible, just the amount of immersiveness in that. But it was kind of interesting because although it wasn't point source, it definitely, I mean, like you could track the sound going around the room. But it, like I said, you could move side to side and you didn't get that off axis that sometimes you do, with, I guess, point source speakers. So definitely was a pretty cool, experience for sure. All right. Like I said, if you guys see some other questions you want to address, a lot of them are coming in, and it's hard to get to
some
all
HDMI
of them.
questions, John.
Yeah, there we go.
I beg your pardon?
There you go.
What's the status of Trinnov's compliance with HDMI 2.1?
So some of your listeners probably know that there are some companies out there that jumped on the very first generation of 2.1 chips and live to regret it.
Yeah.
The partner company that we've been working with for some years now also had that first generation of Panasonic chips. And last summer, they told us, we'll keep working on this because it's okay for development purposes, but these guys are not ready for prime time. There are limitations and even bugs built right into the chip that you can't fix with like a firmware update. Yeah. So they told us last summer, we have to wait and see what the next generation of silicon looks like. But we're definitely not shipping anything with these chips. And I think it was about 2 months ago now, they got the next generation of silicon from Panasonic. Mm-hmm. And so far, so good. They haven't found any, deal breakers yet. So we expect it'll be, we're going to do a lot of testing on it before we make the switch, because our transition from HDMI 1.4 to 2.0 was incredibly painful. Mm-hmm. The board that we were buying from a different company just was not ready. And it was 2 years of a lot of pain for us and our customers. So we're not going to do that again. We're going to wait until it's ready for prime time, and then we'll pull the trigger. We're expecting that'll be toward the end of this year, maybe the beginning of next. So it's not imminent, but it's not a long wait. Sure. And all of our altitudes will be able to be upgraded to the new board. That's an easy lift.
Gotcha.
Basically, just swap the board out and do a software update.
Now, would that be something they would send the unit in and you guys do it, or is that something that a consumer could do it on their own?
Typically, we'd want the dealer to do it locally. They can send it in to us, cool. But that's more time in FedEx or UPS.
So they could do it to their local dealer. So
and if you have worked in electronics and understand precautions for electrostatic discharge and stuff, there's no reason why you can't do it yourself. It's not hard. Right. It's basically the hardest part is keeping track of about 35 little tiny screws, which are not all the same. So, but it's mostly a mechanical process. You just have to make sure you're grounded the whole time. Sure. And then once it's in, you boot it up and call us, and we do a software update so as to tell the machine that it's got a different piece of hardware to use now that you can take advantage of.
No problem. So here's another question, Stevens. This is kind of more of a model question. So between the ICS3 and the ICS7A, could both of those be used for Atmos speakers?
Oh,
you're muted again.
No, here we go. Okay, I'm back. ICS3s are what we call our minimal appearance speakers. So they're really designed as a whole house audio product. They only play down to about 140 hertz on the high pass portion. And then we have a woofer that goes with them that does the rest of it on the bottom down. But if you're going to use them in a theater application, they're really not designed to do that. So you'd really want to go up to the ICS7As, for theater application stuff.
Gotcha. What else we got over here in the chat? So I'll tell you what, I'm going to jump over to a couple of them that I had let's see. So I did that one. Some of these we've already kind of touched on, which is great. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit, John. So with upgrades in most manufacturers, whether you've got an AVR, whether you got a processor, you know, Dolby comes out with this brand new format, and you're like, oh crud, I just bought this one last year or 2 years ago. The only option is, if you want to take advantage of that format, you sell that one, you buy a new one, and you've replaced that processor. So Trinnov has kind of a different approach to that. Maybe share a little bit about that.
Well, it kind of gets back to what I mentioned earlier about the fact that when you buy an Altitude, you're actually buying something that was originally designed as a research platform. It's a software-based system. So, you know, when Dolby comes out with a new variation of Atmos, or when DTSX went from DTSX to DTSX Pro, so from 12 channels to 30 channels plus LFE,
right?
You know, for us, it's just a matter of downloading a software update, which takes, you know, 5 minutes. And as long as your machine is turned on and connected to the internet, we can do software updates. I can log into it to help you figure out how to do something if you've forgotten how to do it or whatever. Right. But yeah, there are a handful of upgrades that are hardware based, like different flavors of HDMI require different chips with different amount of bandwidth. But aside from those, which are few and far between, pretty much everything on our platform is just a software update, and our software updates for the Altitude are always free. So we do cost more money up front. There's no getting around that. But it's, you know, very likely, with the possible exception of, you know, a new flavor of HDMI once every few years, you know, chances are it's going to be the last processor you ever buy. And even the HDMI upgrades, we try to keep as inexpensive as possible. From our point of view, that's more of a service item, just, you know, like customer service as well as technical service. So it's not a profit center for us. We basically aim to break even on that stuff.
So I think your motto is buy once, cry once. Is that right?
Not officially, but you could, yeah, that'll work.
Yeah. So, but that's pretty cool. The fact that, you know, you can continue to get support, you can continue to get upgrades for it, you know, even free. So
yeah, well, and the most recent one being DTSX Pro in terms of formats. I mean, we've had more recent features, but DTSX Pro, we've had it for more than a year now, and most other companies are just now beginning to get to it. And in some cases, they can do it with a firmware update, but in most cases, you basically have to buy a new unit.
Right. Looking over here.
Yeah.
Got some stuff on Kaleidoscape. Yeah. Alex had a Kaleidoscape. Yeah. That thing it's a pretty slick little deal, man. You purchase the media, you download it to your, and it's kind of like a 1-to-1 copy pretty much. So it's,
well, and it's actually better quality than what you get on Blu-ray. There's less audio and video compression because they're not limited by the roughly 50 gigabytes that will fit on a Blu-ray disc. I've got in the next room over there.
I didn't even know that. Nice. Yeah. So you actually get better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So let's
see.
They
have about, on the video side, they have like half as much compression as you have on a Blu-ray. And Blu-rays are already pretty darn good. So yeah, it's impressive.
So here's a question from Bader. So John, what's your thoughts on Amir Audio Science review on Trinnov Altitude 16, the DAC, measurements and filters and jitter test on both HDMI and Toslink and linearity? All right, so he's talking way over my head, so I'm definitely going to turn it over to you. So if you follow Amir, he does a lot of measurements.
Actually, I met Amir when I was at Wisdom Audio years and years ago. He was an integrator back in those days. So Amir got a customer bought an Altitude 16 and had us ship it directly to Amir for measurement before Amir was then going to send it to the customer. And we learned about this, and the timing was a little bit weird because we were about to make a running change in the D-Day converter board. It's actually the exact same DAC, but it was literally like on the order of changing a value of 1 resistor, right? And it was going to result in somewhat better measurements. We didn't, we did listening tests. We didn't think you could hear it, but it was, it was a slight improvement. So we're just going to make a running change and frankly not make a big deal about it. But if he's going to go to the trouble of measuring it, then, well, why not give him the new one, right? Yeah. So we made sure that he had one that was representative of what we're now building as opposed to an older one. And we came up with a score of 100, which is, near the top of what he does. I would argue that the difference between like having the optimizer and not having the optimizer is way more important than the difference between 100 and 97. I doubt that you'd be able to hear that. But some of the other questions. Can you pop up the question?
Sure.
Again? I think I
right here.
I'm forgetting.
Yeah, there was definitely probably multifaceted questions.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions there, really. So anyway, we're now shipping that thing that we were going to do as an unannounced running change. Now, sometime, I don't know, maybe again toward the end of this year or beginning of next, we are actually going to make a new and definitively better DDA converter board available. And that'll be available as an upgrade to existing altitudes as well. But that's, frankly, we wouldn't even have announced it except for the thing with Amir. So now it's kind of public knowledge. But now, as far as jitter and HDMI versus Toslink and all that, HDMI is famously bad for jitter. HDMI, which we usually refer to as the hugely disappointing media interface. It's great when it works, and when it doesn't work, troubleshooting it is a nightmare. Is it a cable? Is it this thing? Is it that thing? But when it works, it's great. One thing it doesn't do great is audiophile quality in terms of timing or jitter. You can actually hear this for yourself pretty easily if you also have a Roon core, because if you connect the Roon core via HDMI to an altitude and set it up as an input, and then set up a different input using the network connection, so it's going over your Ethernet system, the Ethernet connection will actually sound way better. And the reason is that one of the clever things that Roon did on that is if you're a full Roon ready device, not merely Roon tested or whatever, but Roon ready and certified, you're implementing what they call, it's an unfortunate acronym, but the Roon Audio Advanced Transport, or Roon Advanced Audio Transport. I think that's what it is. Anyway, RAT. If you're using that, the core is only sending like the ones and zeros that would have been on the CD or whatever. It's not embedding any kind of a clock signal at all. It's entirely up to the receiving device to reclock the signal and do what it's going to do. And that's especially good for us because the clocks that we have in the altitude it's the same clocks and the same boards that we use in recording studio gear. So they're really good clocks. And the fact that we can actually use them instead of being slaved to an external clock that maybe isn't as good makes a big difference. So I can't guarantee that you would hear this difference between HDMI and Roon on every product, but on our products, when we were developing the software, I was frankly a little bit stunned at the magnitude of the difference because my system was in the living room, which was like 2 rooms away and around the corner from my home office. And I was working in my home office just so I had a full keyboard, mouse, and big screen to play with. But as soon as I made the switch to the alpha software of the Roon, the difference was clearly audible from halfway across the house. And I was not expecting it to be that obvious. I figured, maybe it'll image a little bit better or something. Sure. No, it was pretty dramatic. Now, and Toslink and SPDIF and AES-CBU are somewhere in between. They're definitely better than HDMI, no question. Even if they're not implemented to the nth degree, they should be better than HDMI. But if you got really good clocks in your box, use those if you can. There aren't many cases where you can. Right. So I should probably make that clear. If you're playing a CD or a movie or whatever from an external player, you have to use the external player's clock, because if there was even a slight mismatch in the clock frequencies, we would either, our buffer of information would either overflow or empty out, and you'd get an audio drop when things had to reset. So if you're using an external device, unless it's something really clever like what Rune did, you have to use the external clock.
Some other good questions here. James says, Wisdom and John from Trinnov, can you use Macintosh MC611 all the way around the room on a 6.1.4 setup?
I did answer that in the chat, and you can. Those are like a 600-watt monoblock.
Okay.
So, it's just like anything, you can never have too much power. You can always gain it back, but it's better to have more than enough than not enough.
Sure.
Right. And you would have to have a pretty big rack to put that many 611s in your room, though, James.
Right. Some really hefty air conditioning.
Yeah.
That's a big old thing. Yeah. Scott from Atlanta Home Theater sent me a setup that they're building. Oh my goodness, man. I mean, blue meters everywhere. I mean, tons of monoblocks, and it was just crazy. Yeah, it takes up a lot of storage for something like that, for sure. So Anton says, does an up mixer like Dolby Surround, NeuroX add a latency to the audio signal?
If it adds any at all, it's on the order of a millisecond or something like that. I don't think I actually know the answer to that question, but if there is some, it's not a lot, and not enough that you would ever notice. A millisecond is roughly like pushing your speakers back by an extra foot. Do you hear that? Probably not. Not in terms of the time delay.
Right. And I think you answered this question. We pretty much have the same DACs on both the units.
Yeah, exactly the same.
Okay.
Yep.
I was thinking
we're a small company. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the DAC board, to like create a less good DAC board for a less expensive machine, because it would wind up costing us more money in terms of the design costs and everything. Right. So we design something it's as good as we know how to do and just put it everywhere.
Sock's got a question, more of a technical side. So will the new DACs be available for the JBL SDP75, the Trinnov clone?
We're the OEM supplier for the SDP75 to the JBL Synthesis division of Harman. And I have no idea how many SDP75s they already have in inventory that they have to burn through before they get new ones. But when they buy new ones, they'll automatically get the new DACs. There are a couple of differences between the SDP75 and the Altitude 32. The biggest difference is just the faceplate, obviously.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of minor software differences. And what it boils down to is if you're buying Harman speakers, JBL or some Revel models, you really ought to buy the SDP75, because there is Harman intellectual property in there in the form of anechoic EQs that are not in the Altitude. Conversely, if you're selling in or purchasing any other kind of speaker other than those, you're better off with the Altitude, because we have wide open parametric EQ capabilities. And for that matter, because I came over to Trinnov from Wisdom, one of the first things I did was make sure that we could do all of the PEQ type stuff that Joe's company needs. And as Joe mentioned with that datasat story, rather than manually typing in all of those numbers and running the risk of a typo that could do something really nasty like that, we can create and define EQ groups, meaning a family of different parametric EQ filters, and then just give them a name like Wisdom L75i.
Okay.
You choose the name out of a drop-down menu, and boom, everything's there. So there's no opportunity for a typo, and it just makes setup much easier and faster. So we do that for Wisdom and B&W, and oh gosh, there are at least a couple of others that I'm not remembering now. Procella has some.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a handy feature, and I'd recommend people look into that, especially if you have one of those companies that, like Wisdom, has chosen to do things in the electronic domain rather than the passive crossover domain, because you can do a lot of things with active electronics, you just can't do passively.
Mel's got a question. He says, I'm looking to get a Trinnov 16. Do I need to upgrade my, I'm assuming that says Bowers and Wilkins B&W
Yeah,
703s to get max benefit from Trinnov, or will Trinnov maximize my B&Ws?
Kind of both. We will make the most of any speaker that we are given. And specifically, we can not only deal with the room acoustics issues to a very large degree. Again, there are certain things you can only do passively. There are other things that we can do that passive can't. But in addition to dealing with some of the room-specific issues, we do also build on the strengths of any speaker. But you have to be realistic. I mean, if you give me a really good speaker, I'll blow you away. If you give me a less good speaker, it'll still sound way better, but not as good as we could have done with the better speaker.
With the better, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's not like software can fix design flaws in a speaker. You know, if it's,
I mean, there are certain things, particularly with regard to like impulse response and getting everything to time align properly, that we can do a lot with. You know, more than most speaker companies can manage on their own, because most speaker companies are using the passive electronics, you know, the passive crossovers, and there's only so much you can do. So we can definitely improve a lot of speakers, but there is a limit to it. There's no getting around the need for good speakers. Yeah, sure. So Laptop wants to know, like, what series of Wisdom audio speakers to choose, kind of a balance between watching movies, and also it was music. I mean, and your range, I didn't really ask this earlier, but the price range on you've got a huge selection. I looked through your website yesterday and a day, and there's a ton of speakers, ton of different models that kind of range from, like, what price range are we looking for?
So our speakers with our in-wall, which would be our Insight, the P2i is our entry-level product. It's a two-way in-wall speaker. Those are $1,550 each retail. And then we go all the way up to our LS4s, the on-wall, or the floor-mounted version, floor-standing version of those. Those are $55,000 each.
Wow.
And require 2 channels of amplification plus processing. So, you know, you're in about 130, 140 for a pair of those, plus a subwoofer, because they will play 80 hertz and up. Our big Wisdom series will actually play a full 8 octaves out of their planar driver. So 2,300 magnets and single films inside there to run everything. So it's pretty crazy what they can do. But yeah.
So maybe so I mean, so to answer his question, I mean, is there a way that probably is going to depend on your budget, I would imagine.
It depends mainly for us. A lot of it depends on the room. So, and the reason I say that is because since a line source, you know, like I mentioned before, it comes off like this. If you've got a theater room that's got multiple rows of seats, suddenly you have to cover more area with sound. So with a line source speaker, you would need more line source to cover that, or you'd have to tilt the speaker so it can fire up and hit everybody. With a point source, you don't have that same restriction because it comes off, you know, the sound comes off like a bubble, so it goes everywhere. So that would be the number one thing, is just determining the room that you're listening in, whether a point source or a line source is best. And then you would find out, you know, what's the objectives? Is it going to be music the majority of the time, a little bit of movies or TV maybe mixed in? And then you would have to start looking at, you know, budget, you know, what is the real budget? What can we afford to do? And then determine, you know, out of our lineup from that $1,500 up to that $150,000, you know, where do you need to be in there? But we have a very large range of products to fit just about every application. So we can certainly find something that would sound great.
Yeah.
And this is a question that often has come up again and again throughout my career. And I think, you know, a high quality music speaker and a high quality movie speaker, if you want to make that distinction, you really want all of the same kinds of things. You want low distortion, great dynamic range, smooth frequency response. You know, the desirable things are all the same. Yeah. The thing that movie speakers tend to need a little bit more of is bass extension, because of the way movie soundtracks are made compared to acoustic music. Although if you're big into electronica, you would obviously want to have that bass extension, and just sheer dynamic range, because, you know, if you're watching Avengers Endgame and you're playing at THX reference level, that's going to be really loud.
Yeah.
Louder than you typically would drive music systems.
Sure.
But with those two exceptions of being able to be louder and deeper in the bass, I don't think there's really a conflict between music and movies. Something that's better for one is going to be better for the other. I still have L75Is in my living room. That's a Wisdom speaker. And that's strictly a music system. I don't have a television in my living room.
Right. Here's a great question from, go ahead.
I was going to say, I saw a question here from Jessen Vargas. I hope I didn't butcher that too badly, Jessen.
Yeah.
He was asking about the subwoofers. So there's a couple of things that are unique about our subwoofers in that we use what we call a regenerative transmission line subwoofer, which we didn't invent. It's been around for over 50 years, that design. The benefit of that type of a subwoofer is that they're extremely musical. Unfortunately, I don't have a diagram on here, but if you go to the Wisdom Audio site, we've got some stuff on there that kind of shows how it works. But in a nutshell, if you think about our drivers in our woofer, like say, for example, the STS, or we'll say the SCS2, which is kind of a smaller suitcase sub, we call it. It has two 5x7-inch drivers in it. They have the output equivalent to about a 12-inch woofer. The benefit that they have over a traditional woofer is that they're very small in size, so the mass that they have to actually move is much less than it would be if you had a much larger driveway. So they're very quick in their reaction time. A regenerative transmission line subwoofer works differently than a traditional subwoofer in that this little box that you're seeing on the screen here, the sound, we've got 3 different portholes on there. If you can zoom that in a little bit, the sound can come out of any one of those 3. So that thing that's in the middle there, that's the port. That can be moved around depending on how it's installed. Okay. And then inside this box where that little port is, there's 2 little 5x7-inch woofers in there. And then inside there's this channel that goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and all the way back around. So what happens is that output, the rear wave of the driver combines with the front wave of the driver at the exact right time, which doubles the output of that tiny little box.
Right.
So you're getting bass extension down to 20 hertz at like 105 dB. It's incredible how much output those speakers have for their size. And the other benefit of having a regenerative transmission line sub is instead of having a single resonant frequency, which is what most traditional boxes have, ours actually has 3 resonant frequencies, which means it's much easier to tune. It also has better low frequency extension. Sometimes we call those other woofers kind of like a one-note bass because they have that one single resonant frequency. So you got to smooth that out to really get them to sound good. With ours, you smooth off those 3 peaks that they can get. And when you hear a musical sub versus a sub that just has lots of output, it's really remarkable. And when you pair that with our planar drivers and the Wisdom products, the combination, it's really, really, really good. I mean, musical, they're so musical sounding. The first time you hear it with like a bass guitar or stand-up bass, and you hear that musical bass rather than just that woo-woo kind of bass, it's really eye-opening, ear-opening.
Nice. Great question there. Appreciate it. So we're right at the hour, so we'll go for maybe another 5 minutes. I'm going to try to answer maybe another question or 2. If you've got those, drop those in the chat. Let me look over here. I think I had one. Somebody had asked about, okay, so here's one. This may be a little off topic, but these guys, especially the DIY world, they want to know BEQ filters. That's a big kind of buzz thing going around in the home theater space, and applying these so that you get more of that bottom end that may have been removed during, when they I guess press it on a disc. So maybe can we comment on that? Is that going to be possibly something that Trinnov could implement into their software?
Well, we can do it now. I think maybe what he's asking is, can you make it easier?
I gotcha.
We have full parametric EQ, so either peak notch filters or low or high shelving filters. If it's a shelving filter, if you're into this sort of thing, you can also adjust the order of the filter. Is it first order or second order? Which basically describes, how quickly does it transition from this level to that level. So with all of that parametric EQ capability, and there really are no practical limits to how many of them you can have per channel. We have a good friend in Norway who some of you may know by the handle Berland, which is, I believe, his last name. I'm not sure now. But at one point, just because he had a lot of free time and he wanted to see what he could do, he decided to manually EQ using our parametric EQ, manually EQ his subwoofers so that they were like plus or minus quarter of a dB from 20 hertz to 80 hertz. And he wound up using more than 40 parametric EQ filters for each sub. And it worked fine. I think he was crazy. He should have just let the optimizer do all that work for him. But it was for him, it was an intellectual exercise, and sure, it works. So we do give you 29 different presets, and each preset is like a snapshot of the current configuration of the machine, including things like parametric filters. So if you had half a dozen different BEQs, which stands for base EQ. It's just parametric filters at really low frequencies. If you had a half a dozen favorite ones that covered most of the movies that you wanted to watch, just create a half a dozen versions of your favorite preset with different collections of EQ. It works fine. What I think some of the folks on AVS Forum or the BEQ thread, what they want is the ability to kind of automate that whole process, so that they're imagining a database that would work hand in glove with your Strato, for example, the Kaleidoscape, so that when a certain movie was played, there'd be metadata that indicated what the parametric values should be according to the base EQ folks, and it would just all happen automatically. And if the infrastructure is out there and the demand is there, that's certainly something we could do. I don't want to mislead people, or there's nothing in the product pipeline to do that yet.
Gotcha.
But it's certainly possible.
Hey, cool. Michael, I had one quick thing to follow up on the subwoofer stuff. Somebody had mentioned dope action, big fact 614. Anyway, he was mentioning something about Bose, and actually, if you've seen the Bose wave radios, they use a transmission line subwoofer. The difference is it's a very small driver. It's like a 2-inch twiddler, we call it, like a twiddler woofer tweeter thingy. And but it's not regenerative. So it's got a single little driver. The sound snakes through that box until it fires out. So you get good bass extension out of that little tiny driver. The difference with ours is we use the back wave and the front wave and join it at the output, which doubles the output over a traditional, just a transmission line. That's the regenerative part.
Right. So probably if you Google it, you could probably see some, like a schematic of what that, maybe not necessarily yours, but what that type of subwoofer looks like. And really it's just like a long path, correct?
Yes. Yep.
So part of that. And
it does have to be very specifically designed.
Yes.
It's a non-trivial design exercise, but it works pretty well.
But just inside that cabinet, you've got this long, I can't do it on the screen. Man, that's messed up. Anyway, it's just like this long path that this sound wave travels through. And I guess when it comes out the end, the back wave and the front wave are meeting together. And so now you've got even more output.
Yep, exactly.
Very cool. So I haven't heard of that. I've heard of different, especially in the DIY, guys will build, and I honestly, I even forget what type of subwoofers they are, but they'll use like a single 12 in a whole theater room. And I'm like, how in the world? Like maybe Danley, I think they do some of that.
Danley has what they call it a tapped horn.
Yes.
Which, it's the same basic design.
Yeah.
I was at Wisdom when we started doing all those woofers, and just within the company, we sort of objected to the idea of calling it a horn because it really isn't a horn. So we cooked up the regenerative transmission line, which I think is more descriptive, but it's the same idea.
Gotcha. Super cool. Well, guys, we are up on 1 hour and 15. I just want to say thanks so much. Number one, we had an incredible weekend with Alex. Alex, I know you're in the chat. Thank you for opening up your incredible home, sharing it with us, audio enthusiasts and home theater enthusiasts. We just had a blast. You were an incredible host, and getting to know Joe, getting to know John, Chuck, Scott and his wife. we just had an absolute phenomenal time. And so I'm grateful that both Wisdom and Trinnov saw the value in this product or project, I guess, in this collaboration, to fly me up there and let's just have some fun and bring these two great companies that are just doing some awesome stuff in the home theater space as well as 2-channel space, to kind of educate all of us and to share their passion for audio. So definitely appreciate your time, fellas. Anything before we wrap up?
Well, I just saw James asked whether you can use our microphone with a data sat.
Okay.
And the short answer is no. That microphone is the enabling technology for another one of our technologies that's called remapping that we haven't talked about. But the Altitude is the only product that has remapping. Well, Trinnov products are the only ones that have remapping. So gotcha. The data sat, it's a good product, but it wouldn't know what to do with that microphone.
And John, you mentioned earlier you've got some additional videos on your Trinnov channel.
Oh gosh!
So definitely head over there and check that out. You said you do a podcast or a webinar. How often?
So we have a couple of different resources online. The YouTube channel, our marketing manager Benoit Munoz is a fabulous video producer, and almost everything on that channel comes from him. And it's a very professional, very distinctive style. You'll figure it out. The other resource, if you want to go back and look at some of the webinars we've done over the last year or so, the URL is gotostage.com/Trinnov. So GoToStage is the archival service that's associated with GoToWebinar, which is the platform we use. But there are a bunch of webinars on there. I think you just have to sign up with your email address or something so that gotcha. They have some idea who you are.
So they can.
But everything's there. It's free.
Very cool. Joe, anything from you?
No, I'm good. That was a great time.
Awesome.
I left my email out there. If people have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out, and happy to help with anything. Send you off to good dealers wherever you're at. And our factory's in Carson City. If anybody's out there and you would love to come by and get a full-blown factory tour and demos, we are happy to do that.
That sounds like another Youth Man trip right there, man.
I think it should be. For sure.
I'd love to do stuff like that. I've done one for Polk Audio. I did one for JTR. I just love giving people the inside scoop and what goes into making speakers and amplifiers and all this cool stuff that we all enjoy. And so
right.
Maybe we can get that in the works. Well, guys, I hope everybody has an awesome week. Subscribe to the channel. We've got a ton of more content coming for you. And anyway, we'll just wrap it up. Fellas, if you want to just hang tight after I hit end, and we'll just wrap up real quick. So love you guys. Great. Appreciate all your support, and we'll catch you in the next video.
All right. Bye, everybody.